Welcome to China Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insight and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China is changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today, we're going to be talking about U.S. national security, specifically what the United States should be doing in the Indo-Pacific in the face of an increasingly powerful and assertive China. Most of the focus of the Trump administration for the past 5 months has been on trade and on the bilateral trade deficit, on what we should do about fentanyl and its precursors coming to the United States from China, and how we should balance our trade, our technology, and our national security. But there are other issues in the U.S.-China relationship that also deserve our attention, like China's growing military capabilities and presence in the Indo-Pacific. So to help us understand why this issue matters, what the Trump administration strategy is, and what more we should be doing, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ely Ratner. Ely is a principal at the Marathon Initiative and formerly served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the Biden administration. Welcome, Ely.
Great to be here, Liz.
So, Ely, let's start with the basics. What is the Indo-Pacific, and why should we care about it?
Well, maybe I'll just start from a defense and security perspective, since you've obviously talked to a lot of different experts about Asia and China. And from my perspective, looking out, what we see is a very challenging security environment insofar as for several decades, we had great power peace in the Indo-Pacific. We had a system that was guided by U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and that provided the foundations for just the remarkable economic growth that we've seen throughout the region and frankly, throughout the world. But what we've seen in the last few decades is big changes, obviously, in the PRC with very rapid military modernization. But that is not only just military modernization. The real challenge is that has been conjoined with what we understand is, frankly, ambition in Beijing to reorder, refashion the international system. And you heard repeatedly during the Biden administration, whether it was in the National Defense Strategy or the National Security Strategy, that China was the only country in the world with both the will and increasingly the capability to change the international system in a way that would really disadvantage the United States. So we see that potential coming, and it would happen in ways that could be very destabilizing to trade, to technology, and frankly, to U.S. interests. So from the perspective of the Pentagon, during the Biden administration, we articulated China as what we called the pacing challenge, which was the principal effort that the Pentagon needed to focus on to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific.
So if you were to say sort of what are China's top 3 ambitions, you talked about sort of reordering the international system or reshaping the international system. But if you were just to focus on the Indo-Pacific itself, what would you say were China's sort of top 3 ambitions for changing the structure of the relationships or the architecture there?
Well, I think the overriding goal is to dominate the Western Pacific and the East Asian littoral, and the specific objectives therein would be, number 1, the seizure and control of Taiwan, number 2, effective control of the South China Sea, and number 3, undermining, breaking apart if possible, but at least undermining and weakening U.S. alliances such that China had effective control of its periphery all the way up from the East China Sea down through the Taiwan Strait and through the South China Sea. And thereby, it's not just a military issue. Once you control the sea lanes, you are therefore controlling the flow of people and commerce and technology and ultimately diplomacy and politics as well.
And what do you see as its strategy for doing this? I mean, you mentioned it's got a very aggressive military buildup. Is it building bases? Is it forging new security relationships with actors in the region? How's it going about trying to realize its objectives?
It's done a little bit, Liz, of what you just described in terms of trying to build stronger security ties with other countries. Has been pursuing overseas basing opportunities. We could talk about that separately, but primarily it has been building up its own capability to unilaterally achieve these objectives through aggression. And the way it's doing that is a little bit different vis-a-vis Taiwan or in other areas, but it has been very focused on building the capability to prevent the United States from being able to intervene into the Western Pacific to defend its allies and partners. So that's at the high level of military operations. And then, as you know, it's been working in a very coercive day-to-day fashion through a combination of its military, its Coast Guard, what's called its maritime militia, supposedly civilian vessels that are coordinating with its defense agencies and bit by bit chipping away at some of the norms and international law and sovereignty of other countries in the region to try to more slowly and incrementally achieve its goals. So it is, on the one hand, trying to achieve its revisionist aims without fighting, while also preparing to use aggression if necessary.
So you were one of the chief architects of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy during the Biden administration. How did you approach the challenge that you saw? What were sort of the key elements of the Biden administration Indo-Pacific Strategy?
Well, the dominant principle was one of deterrence. So the primary question was, how do we sustain stability and peace, and how do we prevent Chinese aggression? So that's always important to point out, because the United States does not have territorial ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. It does not have offensive aims. It's not planning to, for any reason, attack China itself. So it's very much about defending the territorial status quo and defending the sovereignty of our allies and partners. So that's the overriding objective. The ways that we did that were through a variety of means designed to strengthen deterrence. And for folks who aren't steeped in international relations theory, what that means very simply is ensuring that the costs of conflict are sufficiently high for Beijing that it chooses alternative paths to try to achieve its aims, that it does not reach for the military lever or does not choose aggression, because the costs of doing that would be beyond its willingness to do so. And that was important because our understanding was that Beijing's aspirations, for instance, for Taiwan or in the South China Sea, were situated in the context of its goals for its overall development. So it was not yet willing to put at risk its entire economic growth or its diplomatic and political goals around the world to achieve these nearer-term territorial ambitions. So what that means is, if the costs are sufficiently high from a military and economic and diplomatic perspective, then Xi Jinping would decide it wasn't worth it. One of the shorthands that you heard U.S. officials use for that quite often is that we want Xi Jinping to wake up in the morning, look out the window, consider the costs of conflict, and say to himself, you know what, today is not the day. The costs are too high. The risks are too high. So that was our goal, to strengthen deterrence. And the way that we did that was through a few different ways. One was through investing in U.S. capabilities that are particular to operational challenges in the Indo-Pacific. For many years, the U.S. military was focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in the Middle East. So it has been a shift back to thinking about great power competition, and our budgets reflected that in the kind of things that we were investing in, capabilities relevant to the Indo-Pacific. The Pentagon has also been developing new operational concepts, which just means the way that the U.S. military fights, which has had to be revised because of China's strategy, which has been designed in particular to defeat what I would describe as the old American way of war. That we saw, for instance, in Operation Desert Storm in Iraq and other places in the post-Cold War era. So the United States needs not just new hardware, but also a new way of fighting, so new operational concepts. We also updated the U.S. force posture in the Western Pacific, which means just the disposition of U.S. forces, where they have been situated. We traditionally have had the predominance of our forces be in Northeast Asia at major operating bases in South Korea and Japan. One of the things that we did throughout the Biden administration is develop a more distributed, more mobile, more resilient force posture that distributed within Japan and then grew more opportunities for military operations, whether it's in the Philippines or Australia. So stretching out the U.S. troop presence in Asia in a way that increases deterrence. And then finally, we worked with, and certainly not least, we worked with allies and partners in really unprecedented ways to try to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And we did that through a lot of different constellations of partnerships, but that was, I think, one of the notable achievements of the administration. And just all of that collectively, I'll say, I mean, I think that, the way we thought about deterrence is that all of those activities collectively increased risk and cost sufficiently for China that we achieved what we said at the time was that deterrence is real and deterrence is strong. And invasion of Taiwan in particular, we argued at the time, was neither imminent nor inevitable. And we were right in that regard in terms of the period of the Biden administration. And I think that's the legacy that we handed off to the Trump administration, of that strength in deterrence. And we'll see if they can carry that forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that was so striking to me, looking at what was taking place in terms of our, overall military strategy, was, I think, that last part that you raised, which was all those new arrangements like AUKUS, right, with the UK and Australia and the United States, and then the minilaterals with Japan, the Philippines, the United States, South Korea, the United States, and Japan. There just seemed to be this proliferation of arrangements that I think at some point somebody was calling it a lattice. I don't know that name stuck, but it did seem that we were developing a kind of web or a sort of reinforced network of capabilities, and also I think there was a sort of, it launched in some respects new relationships among our partners, right? So that notion that it was hub and spoke sort of didn't hold as much. I think it was a deliberate policy of the administration, correct me if I'm wrong, to enable and to support our allies and partners forming their own arrangements and their own set of sort of partnerships, in the defense and security arena.
Yeah, I think you described it well, and it's a really, really important trend. And for those of us who work on East Asian security issues, it is an exciting time, frankly, because this is something that folks have been talking about for 15, 20 years as an aspiration that, hey, as you described, we have this hub and spoke model where, unlike Europe, where we've got a big collective defense agreement in the United States, or in Asia, the only formal security treaties outside of maybe one between China and North Korea are treaties that countries have singularly with the United States. There are no intra-Asian defense treaties. So, but what we did see, I think, credit to the Biden administration for bringing partners together, but at the same time, we were riding a wave of trends that was enabling this in ways never before. And one of those trends was that what we saw in our closest partner countries is that they themselves were becoming increasingly alarmed about the China challenge in terms of the direct threat to their interests, whether it was India, Australia, Japan, Philippines, others. It wasn't the United States going into these meetings and saying, don't you realize that you're facing this threat from China? Or maybe that's what it was 5-10 years ago. This time around, it was fascinating for me to walk into these meetings and feel like the recitation we were hearing from our partners was very similar to what we were describing ourselves. And so these countries, in many ways, were already underway in terms of their own strategic transformation. India talking about China rather than Pakistan as its primary national security threat. The Australians talking about the threat to Australia rather than believing that China was sort of this distant issue and its military ought to be off in the Middle East doing stabilization operations. And of course, what we've seen in the Philippines, a total transformation from a defense strategy focused on internal security to one focused on external security. And then Japan, in many ways, leading the way in terms of thinking about some really fundamental changes to its historically much more reticent military and defense strategy. So these changes are all underway, and the United States is meeting these countries in the middle where their partnerships are. And then second, exactly as you described, the degree of intra-Asian cooperation has been really interesting and encouraging over the last several years. And that was also in the context of these partners wanting to work more with the United States. So it was not just a hedge or somehow a movement away from the United States, but it was behavior that was happening independent of Washington. And the relationship, for instance, between Australia and Japan, you have experts describing that as alliance-like, and all of these new cooperative efforts and diplomatic efforts. So you're right, we were able to harness those together. Rahm Emanuel and others did describe it as lattice work. I think we struggled to find the right metaphor for this kind of activity, but a web or a network, as you described, I think is the best description. And really the important point of this is that, as I would describe it, these are complementary and overlapping institutions. It was not that one was the prime at the expense of others. And that's important because with ASEAN there, the Southeast Asia-centered regional organization, it was important to be seen as being complementary to what was going on in the region and not exclusive to that. But I think these were more fit for purpose, and the different constellations of countries were in many ways working on problems that they could all unite around. And that was one of the important features. But it was a really exciting period. And I'll say it was a challenge, too, from a strategic perspective, because we went from a period where, again, folks had been aspiring to have this kind of cooperation for a long time with our partners in these new ways. And very quickly, we went from just dialogue and meetings to actual military cooperation. And there was even an excess of opportunity all of a sudden. So it required more prioritization about, okay, which of these really matter? If we're going to send our leaders together, how should we focus? But a really important evolution in the regional security structure.
Okay, so I think you can safely say that you left, office having dramatically improved the sort of security architecture in the Indo-Pacific and U.S. position within it. Enter the Trump administration. Early on, we heard talk of spheres of influence, I think leading some people to believe that the United States, was simply going to be focused on North and South America. We were basically ceding Europe to Russia, and China was going to have the Asia or the Indo-Pacific. But I think that's not quite right. And I think what we've seen, and I want to get your take on this, is that Secretary Hegseth, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, former National Security Advisor Waltz, Secretary of State Rubio, really, quietly, and then I think with Secretary Hegseth's speech at Shangri-La Dialogue, not so quietly, what they seem to be doing sounds a lot like what the Biden administration was doing. It seems like there's more continuity than change. Doesn't seem as though we're actually ceding the Indo or the Asia Pacific to China. And that maybe our sort of position with regard to Russia and Europe is different from our position with regard to China and the Indo or Asia Pacific. So how do you understand the Trump administration strategy? I haven't seen a great articulation of it except for Secretary Hegseth's speech at Shangri-La. I don't know whether you were there, but I'd be interested to get your take on how you think that the strategy is shaping up.
Yeah, again, I think you've provided a good context there, Liz. I don't think yet we have seen either a coherent presentation of a singular grand strategy from the Trump administration, or for that matter, of a China strategy per se. I think we have seen different elements of that. On the defense and security space, I think there is a little more clarity, which is what you're describing, which is that a lot of the early moves by the Trump administration, particularly as it relates to NATO and Europe, did present a certain orientation and skepticism toward alliances and partnerships. And folks, frankly, were watching to see how would that map on to the Indo-Pacific. And thankfully, from my perspective, I think it has looked quite different, that the Secretary Hegseth made his first trip to the region, to Philippines and Japan, and sent a very traditional message there of U.S. commitment to the region. And then, as you mentioned, just recently out in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue, articulated a set of priorities on defense policy. Now, there were parts of the speech that were uniquely to the Trump administration. But when it came to the part of the speech of, okay, on a no kidding activities, operations, exercises perspective, defense and security policy perspective, what are the priorities of the administration? And what they ticked through were very familiar focus areas that we were working on over the last several years, including force posture, as I described, that building out that more distributed, mobile, resilient, lethal force posture, more cooperation on defense industrial base, and efforts to strengthen the capabilities of our allies and partners. And many of the activities that Secretary Hegseth has advanced, broadened, strengthened, continued, do have their roots in the Biden administration. So I think that that's a good thing. And the overriding message of one of U.S. commitment to the region and U.S. commitment to allies and partners was welcome in the region and is a good message. So I do hope that continues. The challenge, of course, is that in the areas of economics and foreign assistance and on some other diplomatic measures, you do have actions that are being taken that are creating a lot of stir and tension within these broader bilateral relationships in the region. And I think the question is, what is the push and pull going to be between what seems to be an effort in Washington, but also in the region to continue on the defense cooperation and the security cooperation because of the challenges from China and North Korea as well, but particularly from China. On the one hand, that has a very strong motivator behind it. On the other hand, some of the economic and trade and tariff issues do create headwinds. So at what point do the politics and the economics of the tariffs become so overriding that they become very negative upon the trade, the defense and security? That's a big question. It hasn't happened yet. So the ability to silo we have seen to date, but there are probably limits to that. But to your broader question, I think for now we have seen relative continuity and also reporting that the Trump administration has put out an interim national defense strategy internally to the department with China as a priority for the department. And that national defense strategy is reportedly due to the secretary at the end of August. So we may see the first formal articulation of at least defense strategy, if not a national security strategy, by the end of the summer.
Let me ask you, because, in the trade space, of course, people were describing the range of perspectives within the cabinet and among the sort of senior advisors as, a team of rivals, right? You had very different perspectives, everybody from, deeply engaged in trade with China on the sort of Elon Musk side to, Peter Navarro, who would be, forget about strategic decoupling, let's just decouple the two economies. I mean, do you sense that there's a similar debate or range of perspectives on the defense and security side when it comes to the Indo-Pacific? I mean, I have been struck by some of the appointments that seem to be more in the Taiwan doesn't need to be a strategic national priority for the United States. It's not essential to our national security. It seems to be a little bit of difference of opinion if you look at some voices in the administration. Again, they don't seem to be, at the forefront right now, but I wonder whether you have any thoughts about, is there a kind of team of rivals as well on the security and defense part when it comes to our China security strategy?
I think there are different perspectives throughout the administration, as you've described, and there are folks who come from more of a what's often called a restrainer background, which wants to see the United States less involved in international affairs. I think that has predominantly been a reaction to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and some of our policies in the Middle East, and even possibly some of the ways in which we've been engaged in Ukraine. So in some ways, that element or that national security orientation has been more focused on reducing or undoing commitments in other parts of the world and hasn't always been very focused on the Indo-Pacific. So I think the arguments of that community are maybe more strongly applied to other places. You do have the prioritizers or the China hawks, or as they're described, who want to put forward a national security strategy more focused on China. And then I think you have folks in the administration who aren't particularly concerned about geopolitics in general and come to the region with that economic orientation. So I think we are seeing different bits and pieces of that, but at least the Pentagon seems to be driving pretty clearly from a prioritization perspective of the PRC. And we have, like you said, some of those more skeptical voices may still be existent, but haven't really manifested themselves. But I think it is the interplay in part between the national security folks and the economic policy folks that may be determinative here.
Okay, so I think that's a perfect segue to your great piece in Foreign Affairs calling for a Pacific Defense Pact. I think it threads the needle in ways that are really smart between not actually committing us to too much more in ways that might appeal to those restrainers, but also being forward-leaning and actually doing things that bolster our security and the security of our allies and partners. So talk to us about what this Pacific Security or Defense Pact would actually look like.
Yeah, happy to do that. And this is all building upon the earlier part of our conversation about the trends of greater strategic alignment between the United States and some of its core partners vis-a-vis the China challenge, and then that growing intra-Asian cooperation as well. And thinking about, as we were doing that building of networks, that building of webs, that lattice work, how do we think about that in terms of a longer term strategy? And it's my view that the Biden administration was a really important period in terms of generating momentum in that regard, but that the existing panoply of informal organizations is not going to be sufficient in the long term for true combat credible deterrence, because it is important. It is bringing our allies together in terms of the current mechanisms. We do have some cooperative projects, but when it comes to no kidding military operations and exercises, it lacks the formality that you need to actually do no kidding command and control, no kidding military planning, operations and exercises, et cetera. So to truly achieve what we're going to need in terms of that whole being greater than the sum of the parts, we need more formal military mechanisms. It can't just be a sort of a pickup game that happens every once in a while. So the proposal that I put forward in Foreign Affairs said, look, we need to move in this direction. The military challenge from China is sufficient that it's going to require more focused deterrent power from allies and partners. And if you look historically, there have been both conceptual and real efforts to try to build some kind of collective defense or multilateral security organization in the past. But it has always stumbled over the fact that it's a very big region. You've got a lot of different kinds of partners with different kinds of interests. And a pan-regional organization like NATO doesn't make sense in the Indo-Pacific. So one of the important parts of the proposal that I put forward, it is limited on at least starting with the core group of Australia, Japan, Philippines, and the United States as that set of countries that is most aligned on the challenge and most cooperatively working together already and most prepared to be moving forward in a collective defense arrangement. So that's the proposal so far. I also think, one aspect of this that we haven't talked about so far that we did hear from Secretary Hegseth in Singapore has been a call for U.S. allies and partners to do more in these relationships, that the context has changed, the military balance has changed, and it's not going to work anymore to have a region essentially configured such that the United States is the primary defender of our allies and partners. We need to be doing that more together. They need to be stepping up more. And that is, I think, a shared view on both sides of the aisle. I don't think that's just, and frankly, among the American people and public opinion polling, they like alliances, but they want the allies to be contributing more. And the strategic and political environment is calling for that. So as they're stepping up too, as they're working more with each other and as we're all more aligned on China, I think it creates the context for an actual viable collective defense arrangement that hasn't been necessarily possible historically.
So one of the things that surprised me as I was reading through, and then you address it a little bit later, is I was thinking, like, what about South Korea, or
Yeah.
how do we bring in Vietnam? I mean, there are clearly other, allies and partners that, we'd want to have included in some form. Is it a matter of sequencing where you're starting with, these four, and then you would imagine bringing others in as time goes on, or are there sort of tangential ways that they can be aligned with, if not formally in the organization?
Well, I would say yes to all of those things. So, first thing to say again is that this is not the proposal is not that this is the end all and be all of security cooperation in the region and everyone else be damned. That U.S. alliances with Korea, cooperation with Korea and Japan in the Quad, AUKUS, all of those other configurations could still continue. So this is not, again, at the expense of other relationships and partnerships and whatnot. But the Korea question, the South Korea question, is a really good one. I think you're not alone. It's the question I get most frequently from a perspective of the membership question. And the answer is, look, it's a decision for Seoul. It's not a decision for Washington. And South Korea's, even prior to the election they've just had that has brought in a more progressive government, even under conservative, national security minded, what some would consider hawkish, defense oriented governments in Seoul, their focus has been almost squarely on North Korea. And they have been hesitant to be engaging in regional security cooperation that distracts them from that or takes a sharper position at times against China. So that was something we tried to advance during the Biden administration, to draw and work with South Korea in other parts of the region. Their own national security strategy called for that themselves, to be doing more in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But those efforts are very nascent. They have a vibrant defense industrial base. They're active on security cooperation, but from an operational perspective with their military, they have yet to be a really robust partner in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So they would have to reorient their national defense and security strategy in a pretty significant way away from that singular focus on North Korea. And they would also have to be willing to work with Japan and cooperate with Japan more than they have to date. So my answer would be, the door is absolutely open. They would make a splendid contribution, but I'm not sure they're ready to walk through that door. And there are others like New Zealand who potentially over time might be interested in joining an organization like this. And then I think the way that you described it is right, that for other countries, whether it's India or Vietnam, there could be opportunities to plug in various ways, as we have informal observers or other types of participants in regional organizations. But I think as it stands now, a country like India or Vietnam is not going to be willing to join a security pact, period, much less one that is quite focused on the China challenge. But that's okay. And I think waiting for all of the stars to align of every U.S. ally and partner in the region is going to leave us waiting for Godot here. So I think it's important that we, move forward with a ready constellation. And frankly, if you look at the combination of Australia and Japan and the Philippines, I think you get a lot of the way that you need to go. If we're talking about the practicalities of deterrence in the Western Pacific, that set of countries provides a very strong foundation.
Yeah. No, I thought it was an exciting idea. Another thing that struck me, it reminded me a little bit of that moment in the Biden administration where there seemed to be a push for closer coordination between our Asian allies and partners and NATO. And then it seemed as though it didn't get quite the formal construct that maybe we were hoping for. But I guess I'm asking, do you see the potential then for involvement from European allies and partners in this construct? Maybe, as you say, not immediately, not initially, but would you see that as a positive, or would it be something that you think would trigger China in a way that would be more dangerous than not? How do you think about that, sort of bridge from the Indo-Pacific to Europe and the kind of coordination and cooperation that might be useful?
Yeah, so those are two really important questions, and let me answer specifically as it relates to the pact. But I want to broaden that out a little bit because I think it's an important question strategically. Um, I agree with the Trump administration's general focus vis-a-vis Europe to say Europe, you should be focused primarily on Europe in terms of a defense partner. That is not at the exclusion of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, but I think it is important for the Europeans to be playing a much more significant role on the continent. And right now, conceiving of European powers playing a really significant operational role in the Indo-Pacific in a sort of a planning perspective, I think is probably a bridge too far. So I would say I think that's important to look at down the road. It's not something that I would reach for right this minute. More broadly, to sort of caveat further what I just said about Europe's role, I do think we have seen reporting that the Trump administration has been really skeptical of the value of Europe at all participating in the Indo-Pacific, and I think they just need to be more flexible in that regard. And I think we're seeing some of that already. And in fact, Secretary Hegseth was asked about this out in Singapore during the Shangri-La dialogue, and he gave a much more nuanced answer about, well, there probably are some opportunities where Europe could make important contributions that was less ideologically rigid than some of the earlier statements that we had heard. So I think that's really good because, again, I don't think that Europe's going to have in the short term a really big warfighting role in the Indo-Pacific, but absolutely they have a role to play in strengthening Taiwan's defense and resilience. So there are unique capabilities that they can be providing to Taiwan to strengthen deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. They can also be engaging in operational activity like Taiwan Strait transits, freedom of navigation operations that.
Why wouldn't we want them doing that, right? I mean, is the
right,
question.
Exactly. No, I mean, the argument is some folks say that's drawing away from the work they need to be doing in Europe, but I think we can do both if it's sufficiently measured, because I think the issue here is a little bit from Europe goes a really long way in the Indo-Pacific. And then there are areas like the Pacific Islands. The French are a resident power there, that Europe can play an important role as well. Not to mention sort of in the exercise space as well, where we've seen European powers operating with the United States and others in a collective fashion that has deterrence power. So again, I think there are meaningful, properly scaled contributions that Europe can and should be making to the Indo-Pacific. And also, it's not Washington's role or ability to tell Europe what they can and can't do. So the other thing that happened out in Shangri-La is we had President Macron there giving the keynote that had elements of strategic autonomy and Europe as an alternative power to the United States and Asia. And that is not in America's interest to have Europe be a straight up competitor in Asia. And in many ways, we want to be cooperating with Europe as it relates to the China challenge. So it's not, if they're going to be doing it anyway, we ought to be coordinating and cooperating as they do it.
Yeah, 100%. So let me ask you one last question here. And have you previewed, or did you preview this idea with any of our allies and partners in the region? Like, had the Australians or the Japanese or the Filipinos actually heard this idea from you before? And if so, what did they say? Or maybe you've heard from them since the article was published. So I'm just curious, what is the regional reaction?
It's been interesting. A lot of it is very quietly behind closed doors. I can't say this in public, but you're right. Absolutely, we have to do this. Others are saying, thank you for opening up this debate, which frankly was the purpose of the article. The article was not to hand over a blueprint, go ahead and do this. It was to generate a discussion about an idea that has been batted around for a long time. And this was an argument for why the time may have come and we ought to have a serious discussion about this. So I've heard from a lot of quarters in the U.S. government, in the U.S. military, among our allies and partners that are very encouraging. At the same time, political leaders in Canberra and elsewhere are dealing with some of those economic and political tensions, and it's hard for them to lean forward right now and say, now's the time that we need to do something really ambitious with the United States. So aligning the politics to actually do something like this will take a lot of leadership and the right sort of political moment. But at the same time, one of the things that is embedded in the article is the point that a lot of the foundation for something like this, the pieces are already being built. And so this is to say, let's accelerate, let's keep going, let's be focused. And as we build our cooperative elements out in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's new command and control efforts in Japan or in the Philippines, or new intelligence sharing mechanisms or maritime domain awareness operations, that we think about how to ensure that we are either including or can include this constellation of partners. And so the foundation, the defense establishments can continue moving forward on this without necessarily political leaders putting up a big banner. And frankly, also the amount of work that needs to be done between now and the actual rollout of an initiative like this means that in practice, it could be something that happens subsequent to Donald Trump's second term as it relates to the calendar. So maybe that would open up political imagination for people as well. But I recognize the challenging political environment. That's something that people always say, how could you be proposing something like this at a time where the Trump administration is so hostile to our alliances? And the response to that in part is, look at what's actually happening in the Indo-Pacific, which is a story of continuity and moving forward. And also, we got to figure out how we're going to work on to align the economic piece with the security piece. So recognize the challenges, but I think the need for it is so great. And the sort of mega trends that are bigger than the Trump administration are driving us toward this anyway.
Yeah. And I think, again, one of the really smart things in the article is that it doesn't call out for a huge new investment of U.S. military resources and funding. That's not the centerpiece of your argument, right? What it really is about is coordination, working together, aligning, command and control, doing these kinds of things. And so you're not saying we need to be spending more, as the centerpiece of this new Pacific Defense Pact. And I think that's got to be an appealing element for the Trump administration. But as you say,
well, not only that, let me just build on that for 2 seconds, because it's worth saying one more thing about this, which is from the allies' perspective, they already have a treaty with the United States. They already have a defense treaty with Donald Trump's United States. And so that already exists. What we're talking about here, the real novel innovation here, is actually the intra-Asian connections and formalizing mutual obligation between the partners. And in many ways, that's something that should be that should be even more attractive in an environment where there are questions about where the United States might come down on some of these issues. So the big leap is between the Asian partners. And exactly as you're describing, from the U.S. perspective, there are no new obligations or spending.
Yeah. Okay, so I always end with a couple of quick questions just to get your thoughts and your input so that our listeners can take away some additional piece of advice. So when you think about the China space and what article or book would you recommend to our listeners? What should they read to get maybe more up to speed on the kinds of issues that you're talking about?
Well, maybe I'll give you a book that was instructive to me as I've been coming up through the field. And it's not one about sort of the guns and bombs of the PLA, but I really, really enjoyed Evan Osnos's book, Age of Ambition, which is now maybe 10 plus years old, if not quite a bit older than that, which was, I think, just really interesting to hear about the people in China and how they're experiencing all the different forces that are driving through that country. Having lived there myself and traveled extensively around the country, even though the writing that I do and the work that I do is often at the national level and the geopolitical level and about big structural forces, understanding what life in reality looks like on the ground in that country at an individual level, I think is really important and super interesting. So that is something that has always stuck with me, and I always enjoy those kinds of books.
Yeah, it's a great book, and was, of course, a National Book Award winning.
Right. So it's not just me, I guess. Yeah. So, and he's sort of a good writer too, that guy. I don't know if anyone's heard of him.
Writer. And so you and millions of other people would.
Yes. So maybe all your viewers have already read it. But if not, go to your local library. And then the other, I would just say the other thing that I enjoy reading as somebody who is not deeply steeped in economics is all the work coming out of the Rhodium Group and Dan Rosen. I think they're doing some of the most interesting on the ground economic analysis. So much of what we read about the Chinese economy is coming from officialdom. And I think they have do a great job of sort of cutting through that with a different perspective. So I consume all of their work every chance I get.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, you had Dan on the podcast earlier this year. Okay, if there's an issue that you think that we need to know more about when it comes to China and we don't, what would that be?
Well, I would say one issue that I have been increasingly interested in talking to allies and partners has been the role of Chinese influence in democracies around the Indo-Pacific. It is interesting to me, having been the role that I was in before and continuing some of those conversations with allies and partners. It's really fascinating the degree to which, whether it's Australia, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, India, all of these leaders, they're worried about the national security issues and the external defense issues, but they're also really worried about what's happening in their own politics in terms of the ways in which parts of the Chinese system are affecting and manipulating their media environment, their political environment. And they're all going through it on a very individual basis, but it's a pattern that's replicated throughout the region. So I know that there are folks who have worked on this issue and studied this issue, but from a policy and strategy perspective, it feels to me like one that merits a little bit more attention because of the really significant effect that it's going to have on not only our allies and partners, but on U.S. interests as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, some countries in the region, like Australia, certainly, Australia was really the canary in the coal mine, I think, when it, comes to this issue. But there are many others that are probably not, have not mounted as robust a research or defense effort as they probably need to. Okay, one last question. What do you think is the likelihood of a Nixon-Mao sort of transformative moment in the U.S.-China relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
I would score it as relatively low, and I don't think that's because of Donald Trump. We may get something that is announced or looks or pretends to be some very significant historic breakthrough, but my personal perspective on these issues, Liz, as you know, is that the United States and China have competing visions of the future. I don't think there is a lot of overlap in our Venn diagrams of our preferred outcomes for the Indo-Pacific, and I think it's a challenge of competing interests that will need to be wrestled out over time. And I don't think at this point there is a grand strategic bargain to be struck. So if one were announced or attempted, I don't think it would sustain for very long. And we're just going to have to work through this period. And with the proposals we've been talking about today, try to find a way to thread the needle to maintain peace and stability through a period that, from my perspective, will be a very contested environment that in some ways is separated from the personalities of the leaders themselves.
Well, Eli, I can't thank you enough for taking time to speak with me today and for sharing really just a fascinating set of insights and vision, I think, for the future of Indo-Pacific security. I think you are always on the cutting edge when it comes to thinking about new ideas for the United States and what we need to do to advance our regional security. So really appreciate your ideas and your time and, of course, your service, and look forward to the next administration when perhaps you won't just be Assistant Secretary of Defense, but who knows what role you might play in the next Democratic administration. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liz. Great discussion.
So if you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more reasoned discourse and debate on China, I encourage you to subscribe to China Considered via the Hoover Institution YouTube channel or podcast platform of your choice.